How do your students engage with culture in your classroom? Now, one way to approach cultural topics is to look specifically at things like cultural products, practices, and perspectives. And what does that actually mean? Well, focusing on these cultural aspects helps students develop intercultural competence, which will then make language learning more meaningful and relevant to them. Now, it's also going to help students go beyond language just for language learning and understand the people who use it and speak it. So in this episode, I'm going to share practical strategies to engage students in understanding exactly what cultural products, practices, and perspectives are, and how they can use that to engage with speakers of the language. So let's jump in. Are you a language teacher looking for some reassurance that what you're doing in the classroom is on the right track? Or maybe you're looking for some ways to teach even more effectively. If you're one or the other or somewhere in between, you've landed in the right place. This is the World Language Classroom Podcast with your host, me, Joshua Cabral. You're about to get tips, tools, and resources so that your students continue to rise in proficiency and communicate with confidence. Let's jump in. Vamos, allons-y. Hello, my friends. Bonjour, mes amis. Hola, mis amigos. Welcome to the World Language Classroom Podcast. I am Joshua Cabral, and thank you, as always, for tuning in and spending this time with me to talk about language teaching and to look at your own teaching, get some new ideas, and be reassured that you're on the right track. All of those are great reasons to be tuning in, so thank you so much for taking the time to do that. Real quickly, I haven't asked this in a while, but if you're not liking, subscribing, whatever the app is asking you to do, could you take a second and make sure that you are subscribing so that you don't miss an episode? And if you have an opportunity and you could leave a rating, particularly on Apple Podcasts, that would also be really helpful because it helps other teachers to be a part of this conversation and to see exactly what we're talking about. So wait till the end of the episode. You don't have to do it right now, but when you get a chance, I'd really appreciate it if you could do that. So in this episode, we are exploring how to focus on cultural products, practices, and perspectives, and doing this within a communicative context, meaning that students are going to be talking about and discussing these various products and practices and perspectives that we present to them in a cultural context in our classroom. Now, this is such an important practice because this is going to foster cultural understanding and language proficiency at the same time. So it's not separating this idea of language acquisition or language learning as well, along with the idea of culture, that it's sort of an either or, but it's definitely a both and, that we can do this in communicative ways. And just this idea of how important it is that integrating cultural elements into our language teaching is going to help students to really engage with the language even deeper once they have a better understanding of those who use the language and create the language and work with the language as they are using it in their lives. And I'll be sharing some strategies to help students engage with and understand different cultures through this communicative context. Before we jump into that further, I just want to make sure that you have downloaded the CI Toolbox, and there's a link for that in the show notes. You can also get it at wlclassroom.com/toolbox, wlclassroom.com/toolbox, or it is right there, the link in the show notes. And in this document, it's a free document, and it has 15 comprehensible input or CI activities for your language classroom, and these are going to help support comprehension and authentic engagement with your students. And this is a compilation of many ideas that have been shared here on the World Language Classroom Podcast, either by me or my many guests. So make sure that you have a chance to get that CI Toolbox so you can have the descriptions of how to do these activities, how long they take, prepping for them, everything you need to be using these strategies in your classroom. So let's get back to our topic of culture and teaching culture in our classroom. And we're going to break this topic down into a few strategies, each with concrete tips and examples to help you incorporate cultural products, practices, and perspectives into your teaching effectively. Now, this concept of looking specifically at these cultural products, practices, perspectives is a high leverage teaching practice. And this is from the work of Eileen Glisson and Richard Donato in their book, Enacting the Work of Language Instruction. So this particular high leverage teaching practice is Integrating cultural products, practices, and perspectives into language teaching is a high leverage teaching practice because it fosters deeper cultural awareness and empathy essential for effective communication. So, this is the fifth in this series on the high leverage teaching practices that I've done. So, I began back on episode 160, where I looked at creating a classroom discourse community. Then on episode 162, we looked at facilitating target language comprehensibility. And then on episode 164, we took on grammar by looking at focusing on form. And then the most recent one was episode 167, where we looked at guiding learners to interpret and discuss authentic texts. So this is number 5 in the series, looking at cultural products, practices, and perspectives. And the last episode in the series will be in December, where we will look at the high leverage teaching practice of oral corrective feedback. So let's take on this topic of products, practices, and perspectives. So let's start with some fundamentals to make sure that when we say products, practices, and perspectives, that we're all using them in the same way and understand them in the same way. So when we talk about cultural products, these are tangible and intangible items created by a culture, such as art, it could be literature, music, food, traditions. So I'm saying traditions there because we said that also it can be an intangible, so not something you can actually physically touch, whereas something like food or music, all of these ideas about literature and art, they're tangible. You can see them, you can hear them. And traditions would fall into that category as well. So that is this idea of products. It's that tangible and intangible item, I guess, quote unquote, items created by a culture. Then cultural practices, this is the idea of patterns of behavior that are accepted by a society. And these include customs, rituals, routines. They're sort of things that happen without having to explain to others who have an understanding of why you do that, Like, this is when we eat, this is how we eat, this is what we do at this time of year, this is how families are structured, whatever that is, they're patterns of behavior that are accepted and known within a society. So those customs, rituals, routines types of things. So products are those tangible things that are created, whereas practices are more patterns of behavior. And then the third is cultural perspectives. Now, when we say these perspectives, they are the underlying values, the beliefs, and essentially the attitudes that shape how a culture exists or views themselves and the world around them. So products are those tangible things, practices are those patterns of behavior, and then cultural perspectives are the underlying values and beliefs within that culture. So focusing on these cultural aspects is really going to help students develop intercultural competence. And we talk a lot about communicative competence, but it's so important for them to have intercultural competence as well, because when they are using their target language, they're not going to be doing it in isolation. It is always connected to a culture. So making language learning more meaningful and relevant to them. So this focus on the intercultural competence is really going to allow students to see beyond language as just a tool of communication, but it's embedded within a culture. And so there's so much that's connected to language that has to do with the culture in which it is used, the people who use it. So they just essentially can't be disconnected from each other. And speaking of connections, these ideas of products, practices, and perspectives, they also do not exist in isolation. Each of these elements is interconnected. They don't just exist on their own. Anything that exists in a tangible way, so a product, food, music, it is part of a practice, a pattern of behavior where that happens. And the reason why that's happening and the reason why that object exists has something to do with the ideas, beliefs, and attitudes of the culture. So you typically will not have a value that doesn't have a pattern of behavior attached to it. You will not have an object that is not used in some form of practice, and there's a reason why for it. So even though we break this down into products, practices, perspectives, they are all intertwined and interconnected, and they're all used together. Now, I think it's important to point out that we are pretty good at looking at the tangible aspects of culture, such as the products and the practices, but we need to look more closely at the perspectives. So the perspectives are those underlying beliefs that aren't as obvious. And you really have to dive in and see and question and have discussions about and find the connections so that you can better understand those attitudes and beliefs and value structures, because you can't readily see them. And a lot of times when we go to teaching culture, it ends up being those more tangible elements, those things like food or family or clothing or geography, things like that. Really important things to do, but let's not leave it there and remember that underneath all of that, there's a reason why all of this is happening the way it happens, and that's what we need to engage students in. One way to really look at those practices is to consider the idea of cultural value dimensions, and there are many different versions of this that exist out in the world of cultural studies. But with the cultural value dimensions that I often reference with my students, I look at this idea of, is it an individualist or a collectivist society? And is this a cooperative or a competitive society? And these are not meant to be right or wrong or positive or negative. It's just a continuum. You're going to have cultures and societies that are more individualist and some that are more collectivist, some that are more cooperative, some that are more competitive. Again, somewhere on that continuum. These are the values. And what are you seeing in this practice and this product that may be a representation of this cooperative value or of this competitive belief or this collectivist mindset? Another way of looking at it is it direct and indirect speech, because you're going to have societies, cultures that are more direct with their language, some are more indirect. And therefore, some of those practices will be reflective of that. Is this a being culture or a doing culture? Where do they land on that continuum? That will be representative in a lot of the practices. Is this a high or a low power distance? Looking at that from that perspective will help to see some of those practices, some of those products that are created. But what are those perspectives that are underlying all of it? And I'll put the link in the show notes so you can look at this. But the cultural value dimensions, there are 10 of them in this specific way of looking at it. I just mentioned 5, but the link in the show notes will send you to my blog post where I have all 10 of them there so that you can look at the ones you might want to explore with your students, but they're a way of concretely looking at some of the possible perspectives that are underlying the products and practices. My students particularly gravitate towards this idea of, is individualist or collectivist, particularly within like family structures or school environments and things like that. But definitely take a look at the link in the show notes to look more into the cultural value dimensions. So for our purposes of this episode, I am going to focus on the perspectives because, as I mentioned, we are pretty good at finding those concrete things about culture that we can explore because we can see them and they're obvious because they're the products, the physical products, they're the practices. You can see why groups are together or which groups are together, what they're doing or how they're celebrating. So I want to focus on taking those and going a step deeper and looking at the perspective. So how can we look at why they're doing that? So the first strategy is about selecting authentic cultural materials, because choosing authentic cultural materials is going to expose students to real-world language in cultural contexts. Now, these materials can be videos, articles, artifacts, artwork, anything that could be possibly tangible. And the previous episode that I did on the high leverage teaching practices, episode 167, was all about guiding learners to interpret and discuss authentic texts. So you might want to take a listen to that if you really want to dive into using authentic materials in your classroom. But one way of assuring that you are bringing authentic culture into your classroom, authentic cultural documents, those products that are created within the culture, is to make sure that they are authentic, which means they're created within the culture by people in the culture for people in the culture who have a common cultural understanding and language. So that's essentially what authentic cultural materials are. So as we're using these in our classroom and we're diving into understanding perspectives more, we want to make sure that we are selecting materials that are relevant to the themes that we're teaching and that also resonate with our students' interests. We want it to be compelling topics for them. And we want to ensure that the materials represent a diverse range of perspectives within a culture. We never want to present any culture to our students in a monolithic way that everybody does it like this. So if we do that and we say everyone in Colombia does this one thing, or we show only one example and we say this is representative of the entire cohesive culture like this, is not true in reality. So we want to make sure that as we are choosing these authentic documents that we're using with our students, as we're showing them different cultural aspects, that we are showing them that there is diversity within a culture as well. And we also want to vary the formats of how we are representing these cultural aspects to our students, whether it's videos, music, a written text, and catering to our students' different styles as well. So one example might be to use a popular song from the target culture and to look at its lyrics with students and discuss the cultural references that might come up. And that will reveal the culture's values and practices that are within there. What are they seeing? What attitudes are being talked about? What objects are you seeing possibly in a music video? Who's there? Who is not? And then to look deeper and ask the why. What are the beliefs? What are the values? What are the attitudes that inform that? And that's where you can really get to understanding where the culture is with that. So the next strategy is looking at contextualizing our cultural practices. And this is going to help students understand cultural practices by providing a context of background information. And this makes the practice more meaningful and relatable. So, for example, we want to provide historical and social context for the cultural practice that we're teaching. So we could do this with stories and documentaries or interviews to show the practices in action that will explain their significance. And we want to encourage our students to compare and contrast these practices with their own culture to deepen their understanding. So always putting everything in a context. What is the historical context behind this? Yes, this is a tradition. Yes, this is some sort of festival. Yes, this is what they are eating. This is what their family structure looks like. But what is the historical context behind it? What has influenced it? How is it changing? Is this staying the same? Is it advancing? Is it not? Are things changing within the culture and the society? All of that context is going to help students to see it that way. So an example of an activity like that could be discussing meals and when and how they're prepared. Are there certain foods that happen at particular times of the year? Who eats together and when? And then also compare it to food traditions in the student's own culture and try to get them to articulate what are their values, what are their beliefs that are informing how they are engaging in their own practice. And once they're able to do that, then they can sort of transfer that to the way they see it in another culture. The next strategy is to really look at culture from a communicative perspective, where students are having dialogue and interacting about these topics, because these conversations are going to involve more open-ended, student-centered discussions, which are going to encourage students to explore those cultural perspectives and to also share their own insights. So we want to create opportunities for students to discuss cultural topics in small groups, pairs. Sometimes they're not going to be so open to doing it in a larger group. And we also want to make sure that we are using open-ended questions that prompt students to think critically and to share their interpretations, not judgments, not value judgments, but the reasons why they think something may be happening the way it is. And part of this is encouraging students to ask questions and to express their opinions and make connections with their own experience. And I will give a shout out to Ben Tinsley, as I do often, and he always says that we should start at home. before we start looking at the other cultures, start at home. Like when he does a map doc, he starts at home. What is your town? What is your city? What is your state? What is your country? What is your geography? What is your weather? And then we'll look at the other countries, but understanding your own first. And I would say that we do this the same way when it comes to culture. Like start at home. Understand why you are doing something before you try to understand why somebody else is doing something. So shout out to Ben Tinsley, who always brings us back to that very concrete place of a place to start and how we can work with our students from there. So an example of an activity you might want to do is a map talk, or you can explore a cultural practice and have students discuss in small groups, and they can look at how this practice reflects the values and beliefs of the culture. So a prompt like, what do you think this practice says about the cultural values? What are some possible reasons, so that they can look into it and try to figure it out? And again, when we're looking at cultural perspectives, there's not going to be a right or wrong answer. There's not going to be a definite, yes, this is the reason why. You're sort of speculating when you're looking at it, trying to figure it out, and keeping in mind that not everyone within the culture is going to have the same exact values and belief system, that you're going to have variety and diversity within any culture anyway. The next strategy is reflecting on those cultural perspectives. So this is really what we're getting to. So this reflection is what's going to help students internalize what they have learned and consider how it influences their understanding of the target culture and their own. So as they are engaging in this reflective process, we want to use writing prompts that encourage students to articulate their thoughts and insights, and have them create comparison charts or Venn diagrams, brain frames, to visually represent similarities and differences between the cultures. Then you could perhaps facilitate whole class discussions where students can share their reflections and learn from each other. So you could ask students to write their reflection on how their perceptions of the target language culture have changed after learning about its practices and perspectives, and then to share those with the class in general. This is always going to be an ongoing process with them, and better understanding what's happening within a culture. And the last strategy involves integrating this culture learning with the language skills. So integrating cultural learning with language skills, this is going to ensure that students apply their linguistic knowledge in a culturally appropriate way. So this means that we want to design activities that require students to use the target language to discuss and analyze cultural topics, and then use perhaps role plays or simulations to practice cultural interactions in the target language, being careful about stereotypes, of course. And then we want to incorporate cultural content into assessments as well, to evaluate students' cultural understanding along with their language proficiency. Now, this always comes up, the question of how much of this do we do in the target language? A lot of this is going to depend on the proficiency level of your class. If you have an intermediate, mid to high class, they can certainly dive into all of this with their target language skills. If you're more at the novice level, I would say start at the novice level by focusing on the products and the practices, because that is going to be those single word, phrase, one sentence descriptions of what they're seeing. And as they are engaging with the target language and they have higher proficiency levels, they can go further into the practices, the products, and the perspectives that are beneath it. But if you look at the target language proficiency level, if you have students who are at the one-word level, they can identify individual things that they see within a picture or on a screen. And if they're at the intermediate low level, where they can do one sentence or a series of connected sentences, they can do a description where they'll say what they see and then how their culture engages in that same thing. So just look at how you're doing it. But if you have the expectation that you have students at the novice level who are going to be engaging in a discussion of the perspectives and beliefs underlying a practice, that's not going to happen at the novice level. So just keep the output at their proficiency level. As Florencia Henshaw says, and Maris Hawkins in Common Ground, is if once in a while, when we're talking about culture, if we do it in the common language of the students in the classroom, that doesn't mean that learning isn't happening, because sometimes we are clarifying something that could possibly be a stereotype, and we don't want that to happen either. So just keep in mind that yes, we want to promote the target language use as much as possible in the classroom, but not to compromise what could possibly be a cultural misunderstanding along the way. And again, your own classroom is going to determine what works best for you with that. So to bring this to a close, we looked today at 5 strategies for focusing on cultural products, practices, and perspectives within that communicative context. So we looked at selecting authentic cultural materials, and then to contextualize that so they have the historical understanding and what they need to know to understand it, and then to engage in a communicative way so that students are having conversations and having discussions about what they're seeing so that they can get to what those perspectives really are. And then we looked at reflecting on cultural perspectives in a written way and to be introspective and starting from home with their own thoughts, and then integrating that cultural learning with their language skills. So it's not a time for language and a time for culture, but you're integrating them and using them together. So a final thought would just be that, incorporating cultural elements into your language teaching is certainly going to enrich the learning experience of your students, and it's going to help them to be more competent and empathetic communicators, which is so important. So I encourage you to integrate these strategies into your teaching, observe how your students engage with and understand the target culture, and adjust your approach as needed. That's what we always do as teachers. And then be sure to share out with all of us on social media what you are coming up with. So be sure to download the CI Toolbox, which is in the show notes, also available at wlclassroom.com/toolbox. And this has 15 CI activities for your classroom. And these are all a compilation of ideas that have been shared by me and my guests on the podcast. So make sure you get that so you have that ready to go in your classroom. While you're in the show notes, you'll also see the link for Talking Points, which is my weekly email newsletter with tips and resources for language teaching. And there's also those links, as you know, to get in touch with me if you would like to work together. And we can do that in person in your school or remotely. I will talk to you soon. Bye for now. Thank you for listening to the World Language Classroom podcast. Be sure to follow or subscribe wherever you're listening so that you never miss an episode. Let's keep the conversation going on social media. Connect with me on X, aka Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram at WL Classroom. And for even more valuable resources, visit my website, wlclassroom.com, where you'll find over 300 blog posts about language teaching. So stay inspired, keep growing, and continue making a difference in your language classroom.